Namaste, Sat Shri Akal, and welcome to Dharma Explorers. Dharma Explorers is a series of conversations with prominent personalities who are strong supporters of Sanatan Dharma but were not born in Hindu household. I'm your host, Jay Bansal. I'm affiliated with the Vishwa Hindu Parishad of America, where I serve as the Vice President of Education. And now it is truly an honor and pleasure to welcome Sarah Gates ji from Australia. Sarah ji, namaste.
Namaskar, how are you?
Very
Thank
well,
you,
thank
Jai.
you. Great to have you. So before we get going, let me just give a brief introduction of Sarah ji to our audience. So Sarah Gates, also known as Malini Nath, is a Dharma and ecology scholar and disciple of Kashmir Shaivism. Born and raised in Queensland, Australia, Sarah took the initiation as a yoga sadhaki in her teenage years. Since 1994, she has studied the traditional Gurukul methods in a variety of sampradayas. Sarah has been engaged in significant volunteer work in ashram communities, on the front lines as well as behind the scenes of the environmental movement, and through her research and writings. Sarah has been engaged in research and advocacy for her spiritual family, editing many academic and yoga publications, supporting dharmic education projects, and ongoing campaign with Hindu human rights on Hinduphobia, human rights violations, and atrocities against Hindus. Sarah ji, once again, a warm welcome to you to Dharma Explorers.
Thank you, Jai. That was lovely.
So why don't we start with something simple? Why don't you just tell us about yourself, your growing up years, your family, any special events or people who that might have influenced your worldview?
Okay, so my childhood was, I guess, kind of unusual in a lot of ways. Yeah, my dad used to say that you choose the parents that you need to learn your lessons, which would be in our language to, I guess, exhaust your karma. So I was put into the perfect situation that I could actually leave home quite early. And I was on a spiritual quest. But I think the most influential people on my childhood were, in fact, my grandfather, who was, I would say he was a spiritualist. He didn't openly talk about his beliefs, but he was committed to vegetarianism, and he had these meditations that he would do daily. And my father was also a meditator, but he was much more engaged with philosophy. So he was probably the first person to teach me about the basic ideas of yoga. And then when I left home, I met a guru and immediately, felt like this was the right path for me. And I wanted to learn everything there was to know. Of course, it was very slow and I had to learn little bit by little bit. And I think that's the best way to learn. So it's been a long and tenuous, slow journey, but you have to process everything as you go. So it gives you plenty of time to do that and move on to the next step when you're ready. So I think that was my youth and its relationship to yoga. But I always wanted to know who I am. So I think that's a very Vedantan outlook. I was always obsessed with it and meditated myself actually as a child. My dad taught me, and I also used to do it before I was taught, and I didn't know what I was doing. So I think I'm naturally interested in yoga just by nature.
Okay, I think you answered a lot of questions I had about how you got where you got to. But I'm just wondering, what was it that you found in Hindu Dharma that you did not see in, for example, religion of your birth or other choices that you had?
I think my generation were moving away from religion. So the time of my childhood, it was much a secular sort of life. We had Christian teachings occasionally, Easter, and they had occasionally religious education, but I learned pretty quickly that if I told them I was a Protestant, that I could go down to the library for religious education. So I opted out of that from, I think, about the age of 8 or 9. It didn't really do anything for me, to be honest. And I think my family were, spiritually inclined. My mother was more religious. She was more Christian. And we were able to have debates, and we would discuss things like the meaning of life and, who we were and all of these type of things. So I think growing up in a household where I was able to have those type of conversations and arguments, combined with my father's influence, because he was right into meditation, healing, chakra theory. He taught, I think, Gnosticism. I would probably class my father as a Gnostic because he believed in Sophia, the goddess. He believed that the deity, the god, was both male and female. I mean, these are all very much Hindu ideas. We believed in karma, transmigration, all of these things. So I was probably a pagan originally, I think, but my tradition was gone, and there was nothing that I could, find as a young person. So I moved into studying massage, healing, Taoism, Tai Chi, and from that I met my guru very quickly after probably about 6 months of doing that work. So it was just a spontaneous thing. And to be frank with you, I think there's quite a lot of misconception about the influence of Christianity in the West, because it's declining rapidly. So the actual influence it has is cultural. It's probably systemic and structural. It's our legal system is based on these type of philosophies and morals. And there are some people within the community who are very fundamentalist and orthodox, but the majority of Anglo Christians in Australia are very liberal. So it's a different environment, I think, to the UK and to America, where you have some quite, in America particularly, I think, you have some very serious evangelical Christians, whereas here they're definitely a minority of a minority. There was just nothing else, really that had retained the full value of a tradition where I could, go properly right down to the core of who I am. There's no tradition left in my culture. We've lost most of it, and it's being reconstructed. But when I was a teenager, it was being reconstructed in ways that I wasn't satisfied with.
So let's talk about your passion that you started in at a very young age, and that is yoga. You said you initiated at a very early age into yoga as a sadhaki, and you've written quite a lot about it as well. So I want to talk about yoga from the perspective of how it's been received in the West. So in one way, we have to thank the Western world for bringing yoga into limelight. But at the same time, it's been taken far away from its roots. It's meant to be a spiritual practice, and it's become nothing but body postures and exercises. How do you position yoga in your writings, and what do you think of this commercialization and bastardization of this spiritual science?
Well, my guru was very much opposed to dilution, because if you dilute the techniques and you wrap them up in something that has nothing to do with yoga, like the New Age movement, when you corrupt the teachings, they don't work the same way. And not only that, but you can harm the disciple or your students, because yoga teachings are traditionally taught guru to disciple, not just because the guru is an authority and has all of the knowledge, but because they have the ability to understand your character, your personality, and what it is that you should practice in order to balance yourself to begin with, and to probably burn some of your fetters or your limitations. And they need to sort of have a sense of who you are to understand that there's a very deep relationship between a guru and a disciple. It's a spiritual relationship. The guru-disciple model has been broken in the West, but it's been broken for a long time. And part of that was, I think, the teacher training programs. And they started, it wasn't just white people in the West who altered the entire guru caller training program. Gurus, and I think they were quite optimistic, thinking that if they would make it easier for people to train and teach, make it shorter, and certify people to get out there and start sharing yoga with the world, that everybody would start practicing yoga, which is what I think they wanted, for the betterment of humanity and themselves. But it took a turn in the 80s when things became commercialized. And we saw in the Yoga Journal, for example, if you read through Yoga Journal, you can see it's like a history of ideas concerning yoga and yoga's representation and the market, the industry that was built up around it. So it became corporatized. And when it became corporatized, it had already been on a trajectory to losing its religious elements, because people wanted to turn their back on religion. But what they didn't realize is that Sanatan Dharma is not a religion in the sense that the West comprehend religion. And so in doing so, they took out aspects of the tradition that were, I think, spiritual but not religious. And I think everybody would agree, many people would agree with me when you say that yoga is a spiritual practice, but it's not necessarily, it's Hindu. It's definitely what I'd call Hindu, and Buddhists and Jains also practice yoga. The Dharma traditions also practice yoga, and Sikhs as well. But, its roots are they are in the Veda, as far as I'm concerned. And I think there's a lot of fear that people are going to reject it. And that is part of the feedback cycle, with this cultural appropriation, misappropriation, and then the reappropriation cycles. So some of that material that probably should have been retained was stripped out progressively, incrementally, and then in the 1980s it was remarketed and packaged. So we're dealing with 40 years of that type of culture, and it's harming the tradition in a lot of ways, not just in the commerce and trade of yoga and the packaging and marketing of yoga. That's not even the only thing. It's the knowledge, the epistemes that are being destroyed. So epistemicide, cultural genocide, they're very serious issues. And, we do need to be looking at the pros and cons of how yoga is represented, not just in these studios, but also in academia, in journals and magazines, in advertising, everywhere that you see yoga. So there's a lot of work to be done, I think, to repair this mess. But I don't think that people want to keep destroying it. I think there's a lot of people out there who actually want the real thing.
That's good to know. I think that perspective is at least gives some optimism. But it's also good to point out that it's not just the West that's commercialized. It's also our own swamis and gurus who try to just make it convenient for people to get into it, not realizing that this could get seriously diluted. But you write quite a bit about yoga. I'm just wondering if this dilution business, if you explore that in your writings.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I read what they call grey literature sometimes, rarely. grey literature is, what you see on the internet, newspapers, articles, magazines, and then there's books, which, are non-academic books, and there's plenty of those. But if you look at the bestsellers, I think you'd be surprised, because it's Isha and, the joy of yoga, and, Iyengar's still at the top. And I think that shows that people still want what they think to be authentic, and they want to learn the teachings and the tradition. I do read that material occasionally. I think the real problem is in the teaching, and they're being informed by academics. And when you look at the standards of academic production, the methods, even when it comes to literary criticism, the people who are doing this work don't seem to be very well trained, and they make a lot of mistakes, and that then gets fed into the yoga teacher training programs. And there's also politics involved. It's pretty visible on the surface that there's bias and prejudice, and even Hindu phobia, quite a lot of Hindu phobia, but they'll deny it. The real work, I think, is in the intellectual, critique and the analysis of what's been said and what's been done, as compared to what yoga, the traditional texts and the guru, disciple, sampradaya systems, what they teach and have been teaching.
Yeah. So you talked about the role of academics in diluting the yoga science, or presenting in a non-traditional way. We'll probably get into it a little bit more when we talk about Hindu phobia, because that's one of the subjects that you obviously write quite a bit about. But I sometimes wonder if some of the colonial mindset is playing a role here. A deliberate attempt from the academics perhaps exists to try and dilute some of the fundamental sciences from Sanatan Dharma, and present a distorted view of it to the world. I wonder if that's playing a role here as well.
I mean, if you understand the scope of the discipline, what you'd call yoga studies, it covers a whole range of different academic sort of fields. So you'll have, anthropology, you'll have philology, and Indology, South Asian studies, and then you'll have, so that's sort of more the humanities side of it. You've even got a few lawyers who are in there looking at things. And then you'll have your yoga, yoga research through clinical trials, through cohort studies. And then you'll have, if you want to blend the science and that they're quite scientific, the ways that those studies are conducted. You'll have your yoga and medicine. So yoga for complementary health, yoga as a mind-body intervention. But the issue that we are seeing, and it's not everyone who's doing this. So there are some very strong studies which are evidently doing their very best to implement what we'd call scales, and to interpret results in a manner which is consistent with the traditional knowledge, particularly Patanjali. I think Patanjali's Yoga Sutra is a really, straight framework for people to apply to yoga studies as a mind-body intervention if they want to. So there's a few people that do that, but there's many people who don't. And that's where the problem is, because either they don't understand it themselves very well, they haven't read much, so that they're not being taught much. I mean, and this also falls onto the responsibility, obligation to teach Gyan as much as they teach the practice. Yeah. So in terms of teaching and authorities, gurus, they need to make it clear to people that they should check every word that the guru says against the shastras, because if it doesn't match up and people have questions, then they should be able to ask. That's all part of the guru-disciple relationship. You should be able to ask your guru, okay, well, where does this practice come from? Who taught it to you? Who taught it to them? And are there any texts that discuss this practice? Sorry. So this type of intellectual yoga isn't being taught as much as the practices, and then the general, lifestyle features, which is important at the beginning. But once people get a foothold and you've been doing yoga for a little while, few years, they need to know what it's all about, and they need to know based on the shastras so that they can then go and refer to them, because that's part of the knowledge production method. So guru, shastra, and personal experience, that's been inbuilt into yoga ever since the Upanishads.
Sure.
So yeah, like this is the traditional way. Are we learning and teaching in the traditional way? I'd say there's still work to do. So we end up with a lot of misconceptions, and people don't really understand what it is. So how are they going to write about it and talk about it? They then have misconceptions themselves. We know yoga works as a complementary health or well-being practice because they've been doing plenty of clinical trials and studies on it. They know, they're starting to learn what it does. So that's really important. And what that says to me, Jai, is that the people who are doing those studies, those participants, are doing yoga because it's working. So if they're doing yoga and it's working, it's not that the practices aren't right, it's the fact that the knowledge about what yoga is and the spiritual aspect of it isn't being taught sufficiently.
I think that takes me to a related topic, and that's meditation. Meditation, I think, is another mind science that, of course, came from Bharat, and it's caught on in a big way in the West. But again, this knowledge also has been appropriated, just like yoga has been appropriated, rebranded in things like relaxation response and mindfulness based some brand names like that, so as to present it as if it was invented in the West. So this tendency to appropriate and then modify and rebrand, it seems like a ingrained tendency in the Western world. I wonder if you agree with that statement, or you have a different take on it.
Yeah, I would agree, because I mean, there are teachers, there are yoga disciples of gurus, and very sincere people who do practice yoga. They make it their entire life in the West. There are some very dedicated Westerners, but I'll use a little bit of a very brief example. I won't name the person, but my son just spent, quite a bit of money, in the hundreds, to go and listen to somebody speak about, well-being, positive, positive psychology, the kind of things that young people like to hear. And some of the advice that this person gave was to practice yoga, particularly yoga nidra. So my son comes home and says, "Mum, he told me to do yoga nidra." And I said, "Well, I do that every day. This is my practice, son. And now you know that this yoga nidra works," because this fellow was a very highly acclaimed, well-known, sometimes controversial, but a scientist. And he said in his talk that these, things that he discusses are yoga, but he doesn't label it with the Sanskrit technical terminology, because if he did that, the scientists wouldn't listen to him. So, there's a strategy there. And there'll be maybe other people like him who have been forced by the system that they're working in to remove. Now, I'll tell you one more example. I was teaching at a recreation centre, teaching yoga. I was teaching in a fairly traditional manner, as traditional as I could in the circumstances. We would do, pranayama, asana, as much dhyan, dharana dhyan as I could. But, each of the eight fold, limbs, 8 limbs, each of the 8 limbs were integrated, into all of my classes. I would talk about each of the 8 limbs in all of my classes. So one day, unannounced, actually twice it happened in 2 different centres, the manager would come in with another person. One day, unannounced, I'd turned up, I'd had them all, prepared in a circle, because I teach in a circle, so I can see everyone and everybody can see each other. And they came in and did the lesson, and then at the end of the lesson, they fired me. And I said, why? And they said, because we don't think that the people will be able to understand what you're teaching. Now, I had grown this class from 5-6 people to maybe 25 people within a span of a few months. So that's quite a, it's quite a good outcome for the recreation centre. The problem that they had with what I was teaching is I was teaching with the Sanskrit technical terminology. I was naming the practices, and I was telling them about what they were and their intended effects. So that's my job as a yoga teacher. So I said to her, don't tell me how to teach, because you don't have any qualification. So who are you to tell me, a contractor who comes and teaches at your centre, the yoga that I am, well qualified to teach? Who are you to tell me what to teach? And I made a complaint to the centre, and I said, this is exactly what people mean when they say that yoga is being misappropriated, because you want me to teach something that isn't yoga. You want me to turn on the music. You want me to stand up on the stage. You want me to wear a microphone, and you want me to run them through a sequence that looks a lot like aerobics, but it isn't. So this is what's happening, and it's part of the reception of yoga in the industries in which it's manifest. So I think other yoga teachers will probably be able to share similar stories. And it happens in academia as well. I mean, it's very difficult to write a whole thesis which uses traditional knowledge as its metric, as its epistemology, and as its methodology. It's groundbreaking. And you'd think that after 200 years that it would be normal.
Yeah. Talking about a slightly different, perhaps the same topic, but some of our swamis took these traditional methods and they try to present it from the Western framework. What's your stand on taking our traditional knowledge and trying to put it on the anvil of what we consider modern science, quote unquote?
Well, let's go back to its roots, ancient roots. Hindus are scientific. Yoga is scientific in the sense that it's about observation, it's about experiment. It's about, analysing, evaluating, okay, what is the outcome of this experiment? What are the effects that this practice have? And over time, these, systems have been codified and perfected. And, the whole role is of the yoga practitioner is you're the experiment, you're the scientist, and you're also the experiment. So there's this whole process which we would say could be somewhat consistent with the scientific method. But what this Western scientific method is grounded upon, and I think a lot of people have talked about this, even people who culturally appropriate yoga themselves, and they give themselves credit for their integral theories. They've said that the Western method is based on Cartesian dualism, a mind-body split. It's based on a series of dichotomies and separations that fragment everything out. And what we need to do in science is to make it more holistic. So the problem with science and yoga isn't that it's being done. the problem with science and yoga is the way that the scientists are doing it is fragmenting, reducing, breaking it down, atomizing it. And they're studying, like they do with medicine. They go into an indigenous culture and they see that they've been using a herb. Well, that herb has a whole range of different constituent parts. And when that herb is consumed, it has a whole range of effects that go beyond the active constituent, but they reduce it down. And then they say, well, herbalism doesn't work. Herbalism's wrong. Well, how do you know? Because you haven't done any studies on the herb. You've only done it on the active constituent to make it more effective. Well, that's useful. I'm not saying that's not useful. And some certain practices of yoga could be particularly effective for treating certain things. And that's not wrong either, because we've got a whole range of different, Ayurvedic practices which draw. And, Ayurveda is a sister science of yoga. It's not wrong. It's the methodology and the interpretation. And it's what I called before, I called scales. So they take studies and evaluate them through certain lenses, and they use their own lenses, and those lenses are not neutral. They're based on philosophy. Pretty much everything in science is, there's a philosophy of science. It's not just pure mathematics. It's not just pure abstraction. So to productivize their experimentations, they label things, they trademark them, and then because they need to make their money back, I suppose, but they also want to make a profit. So once it enters into that capital system, and it becomes a brand, then it's not the same thing, is it? And especially not if you're modifying it, branding it, labeling it, trademarking it, and then you sell it, okay? Because it's your brand, your trademark, your product that you have done the studies on, and therefore you have the propaganda to push. And some of these studies, I have to say, they're not what I would call very professional. And I'd say that across the board. There are some very good studies and there's some very poor studies. So those type of studies tend to be quite poor because you can see straight away what they're doing. They're marketing, they're branding, and they will skew the results to suit the narrative. And this is not just coming out of, most of it does come out of the West, but even some of the stuff that comes out of India, it needs to be improved. There needs to be better standards. So I think the Indian Yoga Association have been working on that. But science and yoga are not...
they're not separate.
They're not. No, they're not, because India is... I mean, look at maths. Indians created the system of 0, 1 and -1. I mean, think about that in terms of what yoga is, the positive, the subjective, the positive, objective, the negative, subjective, the relation between self and world, that sense of zero being shunyata. They're not apart from one another, but the epistemology in the West is destructive, and that needs to change. So if you're doing Western science on yoga, you could be destroying it, and that is on your karma. I'll say that to anybody who's out there doing this. Give me a call. I'll be more than happy to sit with you and work through how these could be done in a more consistent manner, a more constructive way, because yoga does work, and there's nothing wrong with testing it out, because we've been testing it for years, but using particular instruments to test it is very different to what we did in the past, like brain waves and heart rate and all of this stuff.
Yeah, I think the metaphor that you used, herb versus the active ingredient, that hits home. I think that makes the point very, very well. Thank you for that. It
does, because hang on, I'll add something to that. Just one more line. If you take the fish out of the fishbowl, if you know what I mean, Sanatana Dharma, yoga belongs within the fishbowl of Sanatana Dharma. And when you take that out of the fishbowl, and it's no longer a complete practice, it's fragmented. And what actually transforms people deeply transforms people spiritually, mentally, emotionally, physically, is the whole kit and caboodle. The lifestyle, because it needs to be practiced. When you're a perfected yogi, your awareness is switched on 24/7. So how are you going to do that when all you're doing is sitting down for 10 minutes and doing a few pranayamas? Yeah?
So it's part of an entire ecosystem, and that's where it belongs. That's where it works the best. I think is the
Correct.
point.
Yeah. And there's also got to be some love involved, the devotion, because the love is the part that really heals you. And that comes from devotion to your guru. It could be devotion to, as they say, I mean, you could be devoted to a leaf. You could be devoted to a tree, but that love, that devotion, and I feel it most when I'm devoted to the deity. I think that relation between you and the divine, the universal self, is critical. It's at the heart of yoga. You won't know yourself until you really love the divine. So if you take that out of the yoga, what have you got left?
Yeah, the problem is that that line of thinking does not work very well where commercialization is the
No.
main purpose, isn't it?
Mm. Yes. Well, this is what they did: is they reduced it down to
You know, it has to be.
active constituents.
Yeah, it has to be. Everything has to be reduced to a pill, basically, or a set of steps and things like that.
Correct.
Yeah, that's the issue, isn't it? Let's pivot a little bit to a different topic on which you've written quite a lot yourself. Um, you call it Hinduphobia. I call it Hindudvesha.
Mm.
And the reason I call it Hindudvesh and not Hinduphobia is because I believe, no one is afraid of Hindus. Because we are, we haven't done anything to the humanity to make them afraid of us. So that's why I choose to call it Hindu Dvesha. But nevertheless, it is a phenomenon that's prevalent and quite a bit prevalent uh, everywhere. I mean, you take academia, you take news media, social media, entertainment industry. Why do you think people are doing what they're doing in this space?
I don't want to become too detailed about this, so I will try to answer this in the most, I think, straightforward way. People are afraid of Hindus because they've been taught to be afraid. So if you come from outside of the Hindu culture, you'll probably understand it better than somebody who's in the Hindu culture, because I'm not saying that you understand, the racism better because you haven't experienced it. I'm not saying on a subjective level. I'm saying that because you know how people present Hinduism to you on an everyday level, which they won't do to your face if you're born Hindu. So you won't see until you really get involved with the non-Hindu community how they understand you. And you do see that easily, I think, in India between sectarian, conflict, communal conflict. That's very visible. But you don't have a whole, you don't have that whole white supremacy element and the Christian fundamentalism and evangelism element that really, if you look at it in history, it stems from that one ideology. Abrahamic traditions, they were ideologically involved in the colonial project. So this has been going on for centuries. But even before that, if you look at the representation of India, there's a lot of misunderstandings. So the demonization causes people to be afraid. They believe that Hindus are superstitious. They practice devil worship. Wives are forced onto the funeral pyre. The deities drink blood. they're cannibals or they sacrifice humans. If you look into the colonial literature, you'll see this trope. And of course, people are afraid. They're being told still today that if they practice yoga the traditional way, that they're cavorting with the devil like a witch. So this witch hunting, that they did to the pagans of Europe was then transposed onto the pagans of Asia.
Mm.
So there is fear. You don't have to do anything for people to be afraid of you. It's not the fault of the Hindus. It's nothing the Hindus did that made them afraid. It's the fact of their own prejudices and projections. Their understanding of what Hinduism is built up over many centuries. When you're looking at the actual psychology behind it, and the history of it, these repetitive themes do appear. So you won't know that unless you read the missionary materials and the early depictions in the media, because during the colonial period, the media would spread these stories and it would go all through the dominions. And, Hindu history is a good example of that. Vishal Ganeshan has put a lot of stuff from America online. It's more than just an aversion. There's a fear, and when you fear someone and you're afraid of them, then anger and hatred arise from that fear. So the anger and the hatred, I would argue, would be secondary and tertiary. The aversion, dvesha, could be primary, because what was the cause of them to do this? Well, they didn't like it. Why didn't they like it? Because they were Christian and they wanted to stay Christian, or their books told them that you people worship the devil or whatever. So there was a prejudice there, but there's a supremacism there as well. And so this gets passed down subconsciously, archetypally, and you see it in the media, you see it on Netflix. It's being passed around today just as much probably as it was in the old days. The way that Hindus are being represented is still the same. It's graphic, it's violent, it's look at you, terrorists, extremists, autocrats, dictators, oppressors. You're hurting all of the weak of the society. I mean, it's the same thing that they were doing in the colonial era on steroids.
I guess I've rationalized it as the Marxism and the Marxist ideology on steroids, looking at the world through the lens of exploited and exploiter. If you don't look like the exploited, then you must be the exploiter. And that was sort of my mindset of why, we are being presented the way we are. I was also thinking how Indology came into existence. I felt that it was academic exercise to weaken the social structure, to make it easier for the missionaries in their conversion game. But you're presenting a slightly different picture of it, and you're saying there actually is a inbuilt fear of Hindu Dharma. That's a slightly different lens, and I appreciate that.
Well, they did it to all the Indigenous people. So all of the Indigenous people were regarded as barbaric and savage. I mean, the same type of violent mischaracterization was, and then if they fought back, they were even worse. If they fought back and, dared to stand up to the authority, they were absolutely demonized. So, there is fear there. They want people to be scared of you because they don't want people converting to Hinduism, because they need to retain the supremacism of their colonial culture and of their religious culture.
Just extending this concept of Hinduphobia or Hindudvesha into the terminology that we use to describe, various aspects of our dharmic practices and our beliefs. It's been infiltrated by some of the terms that are actually very derogatory, and yet we continue to use them as if it's natural. I just had a few examples here. Soul for Atma, and religion for Dharma, idol for murtis, lust for kama, there's no equivalence between those terms. But then there is things like mythology to describe our itihasa and Puranic history. Do you believe it is harmless, or you think it actually does serious harm to our ecosystem?
It harms. We know mantra has power. We know that each letter of the alphabet has a significance that's well past any of the sound, vibrations that could be measured by science. We know that the universe even is created by phonemes, sound. So that's why we have matrikas. Sound is very powerful. Language is extremely powerful because the way that the language is constructed, there's two sides to it, and it's a feedback loop. Your language is constructed, our language, the English language, is constructed from a range of different languages. So we know that it's like a bastard language, if you don't mind me saying. You've used that word already, bastardized. English takes a bit of this and a bit of that, but there are shared roots at some stage, thousands of years ago, sometime prior to the forking of the languages, or in some type of cultural setting we don't know yet. The European languages that English is based on and Sanskrit have similar roots. So that's evident in not only the sounds that are used, the meanings of the sounds. So these words, they arise through our culture, and then they create the culture and they reproduce the culture. So I think psychologists and philosophers have known for a very long time the language actually induces the mentality of the people. That's why propaganda is so powerful. So the way that language is used has an extremely detrimental effect if it's destructive language, because it embeds itself not only in your mind or your disciples' minds or the minds of the people who read what it is that you write. The language embeds itself in the next generation because that's there, it's fixed, it's part of your, I guess, epigenetic, transmission. So it gets passed on to future generations. So if you don't stop using that language, your children will pick it up and they'll pass it on to their children. And if you don't stop and think about what you're doing and course correct, then you can't do anything when you're gone. There's nothing you can do to take back the effect of your actions. That's why we're supposed to act in a manner that's mindful, and I don't like that word, but aware, aware of the impact, the karma of our actions. We need to be aware of the karma of our actions. So using words that don't actually mean what you mean, it starts to divert the culture in a way that corrupts it over successive generations.
I think the corollary to that is that as long as English continues to be a common language of communication, we're not going to be able to extricate ourselves from this conundrum. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, so let's continue from the point that English is a bastard language. It has a bit of this and a bit of that. But at the roots of English are these, supposed Proto-Indo-European, seed sounds, okay? English is available to take up other languages. It can absorb other languages. Yoga is a common word. Everybody knows what it means. Karma. People use it all the time. It's an everyday word. They may not really understand it, but they use it and they have a sense of what it is. The more that the words are introduced into the English language and they're used, which can only happen if we use them, and we correct the record, so do that work as well, then they will become vernacular. So if a yoga teacher uses the Sanskrit in the lesson, the students will not know any other word. My guru never used any other language to describe the techniques. It was always the Sanskrit technical terminology. even the effects, everything that had anything to do with the theory, those words were retained. So I don't see why other people can't do it.
I think what you're saying is it is up to us to insist on using the correct terminology. And if we did that, it's not the language itself. It's what we seed it with, what terms we use.
Yes, and you have to reject terms that don't reflect the actual meaning. So you have to reject them actively. And
Yeah.
Pidgin English, Creole, there's languages which have been built in post-colonial cultures which are based on English, but they're hybridized. They become nativized. So you can actually do that with English if you want to. It's not unknown, and in fact, it's become part of post-colonial theory, is the way that people take the language back and they make it their own.
Before we close, just wanted your commentary on the modern lifestyle. In Sanatan Dharma, life is supposed to be guided these four principles called Purusharthas, Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. Everything is supposed to be guided by Dharma, but the modern lifestyle, or I should say modernity, is pushing us to emphasize Artha and Kama. The other two, our compass, which is supposed to be Dharma, more or less completely ignored. I don't know where moksha stands. I'm just wondering, what is it doing to us, this modernity that's pushing us in the direction of artha and kama? Where is it leading us?
Well, it's part of modernity, it's part of westernization and this mechanization and industrialization mindset. I think if you look at it in a longue durée perspective, there were always times in history where the emphasis on, adhering to the doctrines is going to sort of swing a little. And sometimes there's going to be an emphasis on one part of those four parts and less on another. So it's not terminal. It can be brought back into balance. But India's rebuilding its civilization since colonialism and, centuries and centuries of instability. Now, if you want to become westernized, then go ahead and only think about money. Only think about what you can get materially. Forget about your morals, forget about your values, and just do whatever you can to get ahead so that you end up being the big fish that eats all the little fish. This is a very dualistic mentality. In Dharmic system, these type of things are supposed to be earned through merit. There's supposed to be a balance of giving and taking. So I think that would be, a person's choice to destroy their potential. They'll have to come back next lifetime and learn the same lessons. Moksha, if you read the Gita, it talks about action, knowledge and action. The Gita was revolutionary, to be honest. I can't say anything more. It was revolutionary, and if you want moksha while you're living in the world, then practice the Gita's teachings, because you sometimes may not be able to wait. You never know, when the end of your life is coming. Don't wait until the end of your life. Practice the teachings that enable you to get moksha while you're working, while you're doing seva, while you're raising children, while you're doing studies. All of these things, you can make every aspect of your life a method in order to obtain moksha.
I take it that you believe that modernity can coexist with dharma and moksha. It's a matter of personal choices, but modernity itself is not an antithesis to dharma and moksha.
No, I don't. I think Dharma and moksha. I think the whole system could survive, in space if it had to. It's just that it's much better when it's here on Earth, because you have everything. If you protect your country and make it a safe place for your culture to survive, and retain your natural ecosystems, because that's so much a part of the culture, then I don't see why your civilization can't be restored. I just think that if you live in the West, though, you have to be prepared to either influence that culture and try and push your culture into that culture and correct their culture, or your children are going to have to, face that pressure, which we've been talking about. So India is a perfect place to be a Hindu, but in the West, it's not so easy.
It's difficult to maintain your dharmic practices here for sure, but it's not impossible, thankfully.
No.
So Sarah, we've covered a number of different topics. I think it's been really a very enlightening conversation, and just want to thank you for making the time and for just sharing your thoughts with me and our audience. Any parting words you want to give our audience?
Well, if I can do it, then every other, person who wants inner peace, who wants to know their nature, their self, they're going to need somewhere to go to learn it. So I was just fortunate that I must have had my prayers answered, because I just happened to stumble across someone with knowledge in the community. And if you look at it in a long duration, in a broader perspective, you can see the West has been somewhat primed. If they're in their infancy, so they're still babies. They're taking baby steps. Yoga that's taught in studios is just not even just the bare minimum. It's really they're still at very much beginner's level in terms of knowledge. Not everyone. There's some very devoted people, and I don't want to undermine this, but give them the knowledge that they want, because they're ready for it. And don't be afraid of handing that knowledge over. There will be risks, but you've got a choice. Either they're doing yoga or they're doing gymnastics. And if they're calling it yoga, then, the integrity of yoga is on the line. So I don't think there's any harm in people practicing it, but it is really a perfect opportunity to teach them Sanatana Dharma. And I think they want it. If they're going to yoga, they're looking for something more. And teach it in such a way that it's not conflicting with whatever religious principles they have. Not conflicting. Teach it in such a way that they know the true nature of Sanatana Dharma. It's not going to prevent them from practicing their existing religion if they want to continue it. I think all of the gurus have agreed on this. It's not a conflict, because Sanatana Dharma is not a religion in the sense that a dogma. It's not a monotheistic dogma where you have to do this way or it's the highway. So you can practice yoga. You can even understand all of the traditional teachings about Brahman, and it can coexist side by side if there's proper tolerance, which there isn't at the moment. If there's proper tolerance. So learn it properly and then make a choice, whether you like it or you don't. But don't jump in and expect people to make it how you want it. I think this is a problem of American exceptionalism and white privilege. They expect it to be handed to them on a silver spoon, with sugar. This is medicine. This is strong medicine. They want it to be handed to them in the way that they want to hear it, but that's not yoga. So I think there has to be some kind of a decision. Either do yoga or admit that you don't want to do yoga and go and do gymnastics at the recreation centre. So, or Pilates. But if people are teaching yoga, it's time for them to step up and start actually teaching it. And it's already ready. The system's already ready to take it. It's just a matter of insisting that this is the culture of Sanatana Dharma. This is, You cannot culturally misappropriate, because it will destroy the episteme and it will destroy the culture, which are both types of genocide. Ask them if they want to be responsible for that. I think there is, there is a point which people have to make a decision whether they want to participate in this type of injustice. So we don't need to be walking on eggshells or wrapping things in cotton wool. I think people are ready to hear the reality. They're ready to know who they are, and we're ready for a Dharmic civilization all over the planet. Why not?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty powerful message to end on. Once again, thank you for your time, and I look forward to our other conversations in future. Namaste.
Jay, thank you very much for having me on.